Hello, this is J.D. Stevens, and I want to welcome you to the Young Writers Hymn Writing Series. Last week we discussed the structure of the song at the highest level, and you outlined a summary of what each verse should say. Today we're going to dive into that and talk about the organization and structure of a song within each verse, and give you some ideas on how to approach what each line of each verse should say. To start off, let's talk about what verse structure is, what we mean by verse structure. Verse structure includes the number of lines in a verse. How many lines are there? But it also includes the content of each line. Verse structure can include the idea of the organization of the thoughts within a verse in each of those lines, and comparison of structure from one verse to the next. Having structure in a song helps with understanding, helps with predictability, memory of the song, and impact, and can even help with surprise. If you establish a pattern and then you deviate from that pattern, then it gets someone's attention. Parallelism is a major element of Hebrew poetry. So when we study the Psalms, what we look for a lot of is parallelism. It doesn't have English rhymes, but it does have a lot of pattern and structure to it that may not be obvious on first glance. Take a second and look up parallelism and see what you can find about its meaning, and then resume the video. Merriam-Webster defines parallelism as repeated syntactical similarities introduced for rhetorical effect. Repeated syntactical similarities. In other words, a sort of a rhyme, but it's not an auditory rhyme, it's a rhyming or a repetition of words and relationships of words. And it's introduced for rhetorical effect. It's not just for aesthetics and having some kind of pleasing effect, but it has a logical effect to it, an impact on the listener. I like to think of parallelism as thought rhyme. The rhymes are similar. They're not exactly the same necessarily, but they're similar in much the same way that rhymes in English poetry have a similar sound. Parallelism comes down to structure. It's one form of structure that can be brought to bear on a song as you write it. Parallelism can also show up in different ways. 3 different types of parallelism include synonymous parallelism. This type of parallelism restates the same thought in a different way. Antithetic parallelism is the opposite of that. Think of antonym. It shows the opposite. So we have one thought, but then there's a contrast to a different but related thought, the opposite of the thing. Then we have stair-step parallelism, and that's similar to synonymous parallelism, but it continues to go on in multiple steps with each thought being taken to a further degree, the same direction but a further degree. Let's look at Psalm 1 and consider patterns within the psalm, the parallelism, the structure within the psalm. So as I read it, look for patterns, not patterns of rhythm or patterns of sound or rhyme, but look for patterns of thought or logic or ideas. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He will be like a tree firmly planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither, and in whatever he does, he prospers. In this psalm, the first 3 lines are synonymous. We have that synonymous parallelism. But you could also say that they are even stair-step parallelism. So we have, how blessed is the man who does not walk, nor stand, nor sit. So there's a synonymous aspect to it where they're all actions related to, he should not be taking these actions in the way that the wicked sinners or scoffers take those actions. But I think there is a progression to them as well. Walking is a motion. You're still moving along, you're still moving forward. And then standing, now you've come to a stop, but you're still ready to move in some direction. But once you sit down, you're saying, this is where I'm going to stay. So there's this progression of becoming more and more like the wicked, becoming more and more comfortable where they are. So there may be a stair-step parallelism here that you could say. Then the next 2 lines, I think, are stair-step. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. The first line, delights in the law of the Lord, indicates an attitude and sort of an inner thought process or emotion associated with the law of the Lord. But the second line takes it to a further degree. He delights in it so much you can see his delight. His delight is shown by his works. He meditates in it day and night. He dwells on it. He doesn't just enjoy it whenever it happens to come along, but he enjoys it so much. He delights in it so much that he continues in it, both day and night. Then we have two synonymous lines, the tree yielding fruit in its season and the tree whose leaf does not wither. So we've got synonymous parallelism there. We also have this figure that's represented in two synonymous lines applied to the man. So it's a figure of speech, then it's applied synonymously. The man who delights in the law of the Lord will prosper like the tree. Now let's look at verses 4 through 6. And again, look for patterns, look for parallelism and structure. The wicked are not so, but they are like chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. In the third and fourth lines of this section, we have synonymous parallelism. The wicked will not stand in judgment, and sinners will not stand in the assembly of the righteous. This is such a strong parallelism that it doesn't even restate the action. We have antithetic parallelism in lines 5 and 6, contrasting the way of the righteous and the way of the wicked. Now, if we look at the psalm as a whole and look at the structure of this entire psalm, this would be kind of a song-level structure. We have the body of the song and its message. Then that whole structure, that whole content or message is repeated in two lines, in the last two lines of the psalm. So we have parallelism between the body and this sort of summary at the end. But within each of those, the body and the summary, we have antithetic parallel structures, contrasting the righteous and the wicked. So we have a long section about the righteous at the beginning, a long section about the wicked in the second part of the body. And then in the conclusion, we have one line about the righteous and one line about the wicked, summarizing or recapping the body of the psalm. Not only do we have structure and parallelism there, we have specific word choice and idea repetition. The first line and the last two lines mirror each other, comparing the righteous to the wicked, and using the language that is very similar. The imagery is also balanced throughout the psalm, or it's mirrored, you might say. We have a tree. The righteous is like a tree. But then when it talks about the wicked, it doesn't go to some other image. It continues with that same image and talks about chaff, which is a much more fragile or frail plant-based image. This tree is firmly planted versus the chaff, which is driven away by the wind. So in this psalm, we have consistent use of this image. It's not mixing metaphors, as the phrase goes. Mixing metaphors is like saying, it isn't rocket surgery. That mixes, it isn't rocket science and it isn't brain surgery together. So we want to keep our metaphors consistent unless there's a reason to change them. Now that's Hebrew poetry, and we can certainly incorporate elements of parallelism into our songs. But structure in our songs doesn't need to be limited to parallelism. Simply, what we want to do in structuring our songs is to think about how the thoughts are organized, and that they are organized. We talked about that last week at a song level, but we want to do that within each verse as well. We'll look at some examples of more modern songs and how they're organized and some tools or approaches that we can use in organizing those songs and what they say and what order they say them and how those statements are related. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about structure and music and the relationship that those two have. Structure has a huge impact on songs that have multiple verses. The flow of thought expressed in the message has dynamics and it has motion to it. Music that accompanies those lyrics also has dynamics and motion. And if those don't match up, then it takes away from the message. Music that mirrors the lyrics amplifies the impact of the message. And when a song has strong parallel structure from verse to verse, it's easier to have music that has this kind of impact. If the verses lack parallel structure, and here I'm not talking about the Hebrew parallelism so much as the flow of thought in verse 1 has a similar flow as to that in verse 2. It can have a different message, but it has the same flow, ebbs and flows, ups and downs. But if they don't have that same kind of flow, if they're just very different in their internal structure or ordering of thoughts, then your music has to go some different routes, or you have some different trade-offs there. What you might end up with is music that really matches one verse. When the lyrics are high and big and full in their ideas, the music follows to match. And if the lyrics are sad and it's contemplative, the music follows to match that as well. But if the next verse reverses that, and it has sad contemplative words in the point where the music is high and triumphant, then there's this disconnect. There's a dissonance between the thoughts and the music, and it's upsetting to the singer and the listener because what they're singing and how they're singing it are not the same. So it's hard to be meaningful in what you say when the way that you say it doesn't match. It's like telling someone, I love you, or I hate you. Those just don't add up. The tone of the song should match the words of the song. So music that matches one verse, but the tone or motion conflicts with another verse is one possibility that happens if the verses are not similar in their structure or flow of thought. Now, we can get away from that by toning the music down to where the music doesn't really have all the highs and lows. It gets us through the song, and it can be good music, but without big dynamics and emotion to it. So what we wind up with is bland music that doesn't add much to the lyrics. It doesn't take away, it doesn't conflict with the lyrics, it just doesn't build them up to be a lot more than they are, or to amplify them, I should say. Another possibility is music that is adaptable in interpretation. You can vary the tempo, the volume, how you accent the syllables from one verse to the next. There are great songs that do this, and they do it so well, where the music can be sad in one verse and the exact same notes, really with the same tempo, can have a very different feeling with different lyrics. That's great, but it's not necessarily easy. Having lyrics from each verse that have a similar flow of thought really allows the composer of the music to bring music to bear that helps every single line have the best impact that it can have. Or it allows you to select existing music, old public domain songs and melodies that were not custom composed for your lyrics, but because they have a certain dynamic flow to them and it's consistent from verse to verse to verse in your song, that still works for your song and has a lot of impact, even though it wasn't written specifically for your words. Let's look at an example of verse structure. This is one of the first songs that I wrote. It's called Why Do You Worry? And as I read through the lyrics, look for repetition of flow of thought from verse to verse. Why do you worry for clothing to wear? Have you not witnessed God's bountiful care? He clothes the lilies in royal array. Are you not valued, more valued than they? Why do you doubt when the tempests arise? Have you not heard him say, Come to my side? He made you walk when you first heard his call. Look to the Master. He'll not let you fall. Now you can see here that I have a couple of versions of these first two lines. This is just to give you a little glimpse into my writing process and how all writers, they write more than they end up putting in their song, and they end up down selecting. I ended up going with the ones on the left. You judge for yourself which ones are better. Why do you fear the loud crashing of waves? Have you not seen his great power to save? Now, up above, every promise he'll keep. With him you'll safely cross over the deep. Why do you stumble o'er words Jesus said? Have you not tasted the life-giving bread? Life, breath, and all things he gives for each need. Much more, his words give you true life indeed. Within this song, every single verse is structured the same way. The first line is, why do you have a negative attitude about things? Why do you worry? Why do you doubt? Why do you fear? Why do you stumble? Second line, haven't you observed that God takes care of you? That's expressed in different ways. Have you not witnessed? Have you not heard? Have you not seen? Have you not tasted? But then the last half of each of those lines, witnessed God's bountiful care, heard him say, come to my side, seen his great power to save, or tasted the life-giving bread. These are all evidences that God cares for us. And then the third line starts with the same structure. He, action. He clothes, he made. In the first two verses, then the last two verses, it doesn't start the same way, but it includes that same aspect. It ends with he'll keep in verse 3, and then verse 4, he gives, kind of in the middle of line 3. But each of those lines is additional reassurance that God cares for us. So there's consistency in that structure from verse to verse. Then, in the last line of each verse, the conclusion is, you can trust God will take care of you. You are more valued than the lilies of the field. The Master will not let you fall. He'll help you to cross safely over the depths of the sea, and his words give you true life. So from verse to verse, each of these lines has a similar structure. Now, that's one way to organize a song. You don't have to organize your song that way. Many songs are, and many songs aren't organized or structured this way. But if you do start down this path of having this parallel structure, you kind of want to lean into it and accentuate it to give the listener and the singer an idea of where each verse is going. But what it really does is not just repeat the same thing 4 times, it accentuates what is different. They know the structure. They know generally what's going to be said, but it's exciting and engaging and memorable to see exactly what is said in each verse. For an activity, I want you to find a couple of different songs, and I'll tell you what kind of songs to look for. But grab a hymnal and just flip through it until you find, first, a song that has structure that is mirrored from one verse to the next. So you're going to identify a song with this mirrored or parallel structure, verse to verse. One easy way to identify that is repetition. The first word may be the same in every verse, or it may be hidden more in the middle of the verses or in the middle of the lines where that parallel structure shows up. But it's not just the repetition of a word, it is more the repetition of the structure and the flow of thought and the way that the thoughts are organized. An example of this is Christ Arose by Robert Lowry. Go look that one up and see how it's organized. And it's an example of a song that has structure that is mirrored from one verse to the next, even without all of the words being mirrored or repeated. As you do that, look at that song, and hopefully you're familiar with it. If not, there's a link in the description that you can go listen to. Note the musical progression within the verses and between verses. And this is one of those examples of a song that has a different tone in each verse, and yet the same music conveys each verse very powerfully. Once you've done that, find another song with structure that varies from one verse to the next. An example of that could be It Is Well With My Soul by Horatio Spafford. Note that there is a little parallel structure, that at the end of each verse before the chorus, the 2 words are my soul. So there's some repetition there, but really throughout the verses, there isn't a consistent structuring like there was in Why Do You Worry? One thing that this does, though, and this could happen in your song, is if you have this repetition in the line, if it's at the end of a line, you get one free rhyme because all the lines have the same word. But what that drives is all of the rhymes have to match in the previous part of the verse. So if you do that, you really want to make sure that that repeated word has lots of rhyme options, or you're going to be struggling to find words that do rhyme with it in the rhyme pair. Now here are a few tips for structuring verses. Each line doesn't need to be a complete sentence. So as you're outlining your verses, when I say outlining or structuring your verses, I'm saying, what does line 1 say? What does line 2 say? What does line 3 say? And I'm not saying use the exact words with rhyming and rhythm. It's just what is the message of that line? So when you go to that structuring activity, the assignment at the end of the lesson, note that each line doesn't need to be a complete sentence. It doesn't need to have a subject and a predicate. It doesn't need to have complete sentence structure. But you probably want each line to be quote-unquote self-contained. It should stand on its own, even if it's only half of a sentence. For example, if your first line is, "The glorious and majestic Almighty God," that's a phrase, and that can stand on its own. And then the next line can say, "Look down on his lowly creation." That could be a second line. That doesn't all have to be one line. Each one can stand on its own. What you wouldn't want is, "The glorious and majestic." That's line 1. And then line 2, "Stick Almighty God looks down on." Line 3, "His lowly creation." That would be a very poor way to structure it, because your thoughts will not follow that breakup of that sentence very easily. Let's look at a real-world example of this, of bridging a phrase across lines. You really want to avoid taking a phrase and bridging it across from one line to the next, or you could get in trouble for commenting on someone's pregnancy weight gain. I'm just saying. Consider Silent Night by Joseph Moore. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. This single line of the song has incredible structure. Look at this. There's synonymous parallelism. You've got silent and calm, holy and bright. There's a mirror symmetry to it. Something night, something night. All is something, all is something. And the repetition is towards the inside of the line. First, you have the variable silent, holy, leading the little phrase. And then you have the variable trailing the phrase, all is calm, all is bright. There's this wonderful symmetry to it. The syllables have a rhythmic pattern to them. 2 syllables, 1, 2, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, when you break down syllable count for each word. But here's the problem. This structure is so strong, it's too strong. It does something wrong. And here's what it is. There is no period in the song after bright. I put one here, but there isn't one really. There's not a comma. There's no punctuation there, because grammatically the line continues into the next line. But everything else, the lyrical phrasing, the lyrical parallel structure, the musical phrasing, the musical parallel structure, everything is tied up neatly with a bow in one line. Even the timing for singers to take a breath says there's a period at the end of this line, but there isn't a period. So what we sing and hear is this. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Period. Full stop. Round yon virgin. Why are we talking about this round virgin? The baby weight doesn't just go away as soon as the baby is born. Sorry if I've ruined the song for you, but welcome to the songwriter's curse. Understanding the ins and outs of songs helps you simultaneously appreciate all of this structure and also be distracted by the inner workings of a song. But the structure and this break across the line doesn't just stop with the round virgin over yonder, although what follows is more the effect of the musical phrasing than the lyrical phrasing. But here it is. Who is over yonder, where it is all calm and bright, if we can get past that? Is it a virgin who is both a mother and a child, or a young woman herself? That's what the musical phrasing says. Round yon virgin, mother and child. Or is it a virgin mother with her child? That's likely what is meant here, and it matches scripture, of course, but that's not really how any of the phrasing lays it out. Or is it 3 people? This is another possibility given the phrasing. A virgin, a mother, and a child. This is a possible interpretation for someone just listening to the song. And once the song becomes familiar, really that's all we do. We don't pay attention to punctuation. We just listen to the words, we listen to the phrasing, we listen to the music and how they come together, and that defines what the song is actually saying. You want to avoid bridging a phrase across lines, as we pointed out, but especially you want to avoid that if the first line appears to be self-contained, like this one does. All is calm, all is bright is a complete sentence if you put a period there. There's nothing that tells you that you should anticipate additional words in that sentence. If your line leaves the hearer hanging, it's an incomplete thought and it's obvious. It may be awkward, but at least they know the thought is continued and they won't put a weird punctuation mark, a period at the end of a line that doesn't belong there. The issue is we don't sing punctuation marks, but we do hear punctuation, whether it's there or not. So don't count on visual punctuation to clarify your meaning, even if it's grammatically correct. The phrasing and eventually the music really need to communicate the punctuation all on their own. The best approach that I can suggest is to have phrases end at the end of a line. Whether that's a complete sentence or if it's just a partial phrase, just make sure that it's complete and self-contained when that line is finished. Here's a little behind the curtains of songwriting when you're working with other people who are reviewing your work. And it's a nomenclature issue. When you need to point someone to a certain place in the song, how do you do that? Well, one way to narrow things down is to indicate a particular line of the song. And the way that I have seen that commonly done is verse number, period, line number, or 1.1 equals verse 1, line 1. If you want to indicate line 1 of all verses, or line 2 of all verses, you would go X point line. So X.1 would mean line 1 of every verse. And maybe there's a particular rhythm oddity that occurs in every verse. That's how you would indicate that. Now back to our tips. One tip I have for you is to size your lines similarly from verse to verse. Now size can vary within a verse. Verse 1.1 or line 1.1 and line 1.2 can be different sizes. So the first and second lines of a verse can vary one from the other. That's okay. The size needs to be consistent, though, for the same lines between verses. In other words, verse 1, line 1, 1.1, needs to be the same size as verse 2, line 1, or 2.1. Or in other words, all X.1s should be about the same size because they're going to share the same musical phrase. Ideally, they would have exactly the same number of syllables with the same rhythm. Under certain circumstances, you can sneak in an extra syllable, but really, if we're talking like 4 or 5 words longer in one line versus another, that's just not going to work. So that happens when you get into writing the poetry, writing the actual lyrics of the song. But you can avoid that or really minimize those chances by sizing the thoughts from one verse to the next consistently so that you don't have a big thought you're trying to cram into a few words or a really small thought you're trying to stretch into a lot of words to match the other verses. The outlining stage is the time that you want to do your best to get the thoughts sized similarly between verses so you don't have a really big struggle when you get to the poetry aspect of it. Your assignment for next time is going to be similar to the previous one, where you had to think about and decide on the structure for the overall song, and you broke it down verse by verse by verse. This time, you're going to take and dive a level deeper and do the same thing. You're going to look within a verse and go line by line by line, what is my structure? And I'm not saying just make a decision on what is the type of structure, but start actually outlining it. Will I have parallel structure between verses? And if so, generically, what is that structure going to be? What is line 1 going to contain? What's it going to say in a generic way? What does line 2 say? What does line 3 say? And so forth. What are their general contents? You're going to need to answer questions like, how many lines are in a verse? And that you can work back and forth with your content. How many lines does it take to say the things that you want to say? You have to have a consistent number of lines from verse to verse. No matter what structural approach you're taking, that has to be the same because the music isn't going to change from one verse to the next. Consistent repetition of words or repetitive structure, as in why do you worry, is optional and depends on your song level structure. Not all songs should use parallel structure to this level. So some songs will be more like It Is Well With My Soul, where each verse is a potentially completely different structure than the previous verse, and that's okay. If that's your approach, you don't need to have this generic concept of a verse structure. But for everybody, no matter the general structure of your song, I want you to take one verse, any verse, it doesn't have to be the first, and do a line-by-line outline. Write the message contained in each line, specific to that verse, not a generic one, specifically. What does verse 3, line 1 say? In so many words. Don't worry about rhythm or rhyme or even word choice, just what am I trying to communicate here? You're explaining it. You're not writing your actual song yet. Now, what does verse 3, line 2 say? What's the message contained there? What does line 3 say? However many lines you have for an entire verse, outline it. It's not set in stone, and it's super easy to change at this point because you haven't done poetry, you haven't done word choice, you haven't done rhyming or rhythm. So just really work that message, figuring out what you're going to say in detail, breaking that verse statement, that verse message down into line messages. And that's your assignment for next time. The assignment for the following week will include doing that for every verse, but just really focus on one and get some good practice on that one. Get it to where you're happy with it, and then we'll discuss and review them as a group. That's it for Lesson 6 of the Young Writers series. I want this series to be useful to anyone interested in writing a hymn, so please give me feedback in the comments. Up next is Lesson 7, Style, Tone, and Point of View. Before diving into the poetry in 2 weeks, we're going to think about how to set the tone, the style, and the point of view for your song, and that will really give us the context to start actually writing your song. Thank you for watching, and may the words of your mouth and the meditation of your heart be acceptable in the sight of the Lord.